Hey y'all, we are the Stewarts. My husband, Russell, is an artist, and I am May, and I have an interest in true crime. We decided to merge our two interests together. Enjoy this calming visual while listening to a tragic story. This is Stew Art and Crime. Warning: this episode contains crimes against a child and discussion about mental illness. Listener discretion is advised.
This is 911. Do you have an emergency? Yes. Okay, exactly what happened? I cut her arms off. You cut her arms off? Mm-hmm. And how old is this your baby? Yes. And it's a girl? Mm-hmm. Is she conscious? No. Is she breathing? No.
Dena Schlosser made this call on the morning of November 22, 2004, after she tragically killed her 10-month-old daughter Maggie and attempted to take her own life because she wanted to give her child to God. Dena grew up in Chicago. At the age of 8, doctors found excessive fluid on her brain called hydrocephalus, which most likely happened as a result of an earlier childhood injury. This condition required 7 surgeries to drain the fluid from her brain. Dena had 3 shortly after being diagnosed, and then her family moved to Houston, where the other 4 surgeries took place. She was in junior high at the time. These were risky procedures, and Dena would come out of them clumsy and withdrawn. Her mother, Connie, had an almost desperate bond to her only daughter. They considered Dena very fortunate to have seen her 18th birthday. Dena was a freshman in college in upstate New York when she met her husband, John. They became friends, and after a year, John finally asked her out on a date. They married in 1990, and Dena graduated from college the next year. John never finished. He did enjoy computers and was able to get jobs with software companies. By the time they moved to Fort Worth in 2000, he was making around $100,000 a year and able to purchase a home in an upscale neighborhood. By this time, they had 2 daughters, Brianna, 5, and Kelsey, 2, and Dena was staying home to take care of them. One of their new neighbors recommended they check out the Water of Life Church. This suggestion would drastically change their lifestyles and beliefs, which would have devastating consequences. Water of Life Ministries began in 1980 under Pastor Doyle Davidson, whom God instructed to come to Plano, Texas. This church is not affiliated with any denomination, but ex-members would classify it as a cult. Doyle Davidson had a veterinary clinic in McKinney, Texas, that he wanted to get away from. God had ordered him to preach, so he spent 10 years from 1970 to 1980 poring over the Bible, working only when he had to feed his family, wife Patty and daughter Kathy. When a group of about 50 former Catholics, Baptists, and Methodists were looking to form a new non-denominational church, Doyle knew this was his chance. When interviewing for the lead pastor position, he showed complete command of the Bible, a man without notes for a sermon, and could inspire the faithful to their feet. Bob Buckner and his wife Judy were doing the hiring and believed Doyle was the right fit. And in November of 1980, the church opened its doors. Looking back to those early days, Bob recalled that it was a great place to be. There was no set schedule, so services could last an hour or up to 2, but it was always engaging. The Buckners also said that they had witnessed Doyle perform miracles and healings, but that things started to shift ever so slightly. By July 1981, God told Doyle that an evil spirit ruled Plano, the Jezebel spirit, which was the manifestation of a pagan prophetess who, in the Old Testament, married King Ahab of Israel and seduced 850 men by her wickedness. Doyle went on to share this news with his congregation, who had never heard of this spirit, but over the next few years, Doyle pointed out person after person that this spirit had taken over, including Patty Davidson, Doyle's wife. The Jezebel spirit was so strong within her that Doyle said, "I took her out of my life. God put a sword between us, and that was it." They would still live together. They never filed for divorce. Doyle even provided Patty money, clothes, and new cars. But he no longer considered Patty his wife, stating, "Her and I both understood God had split us apart." This information, however, was kept from the church. They were also kept in the dark when in 1987, God gave Doyle a new spouse, a young, attractive brunette church member named Lisa Staton. But one person he did tell was J.R. Staton, Lisa's husband. When J.R. asked his wife about it, she said, "J.R., don't believe him. You know he lies." So just as Doyle and Patty never legally separated, he and Lisa never legally wed. One church member, Cheryl Parmenter, had a daughter who made comments on how Doyle watches Lisa's butt. Cheryl didn't believe her, as she was swayed by his charisma. Cheryl joined Water of Life in 1983, shortly after she attended her sister's wedding there. She found in Doyle the authority figure she never had in her indifferent father or alcoholic husband, stating, "I mean, you sit back in church and you're like, you're impressed," because he was so sure of himself. But then she started seeing signs that made her think her daughter was onto something. By the early 90s, Doyle and Lisa had taken to leaving church together. One day, Cheryl and her sister got in her car and followed Doyle and Lisa into a wooded area. Doyle parked behind some bushes. She couldn't see anything, but imagined what was happening. How could he? She thought. Cheryl had worked in the church nursery for years. When she started to suspect her husband was abusing their children and pleaded with Patty Davidson to let her out of work. But when Patty conferred with Doyle, he said the nursery was where God wanted Cheryl. She obeyed. And then he is doing this? Her pastor was out in the woods with a church member's wife? Cheryl and her sister screamed at Doyle and Lisa, thinking they couldn't be identified. But a few days later, Doyle called Cheryl's sister quoting 1 Corinthians 5, and said if she didn't repent for her sins against his ministry, "I will pray to God to turn you over to Satan for the destruction of your flesh." Doyle doesn't remember making this call. It became clear that anyone who came against Doyle was also against God. Bob Buckner learned this when in one sermon, Doyle said it didn't rain before the time of Noah. And the Bible doesn't say that, Bob explained. Genesis 2:6 talks of a mist that watered the whole face of the ground. He pointed it out to Doyle, and Doyle gave his response from the pulpit. He discussed how someone had questioned him. It was wrong to question him. He was looking at me the whole time, Bob says. In another instance, someone set Doyle off by sending him an email. Here's audio of that exchange.
"I got your email, and you shouldn't have sent it. When you did, you challenged God, and only a fool would challenge God. You hear me? Don't send me another one. Eric, I'm going to tell you something. You're one prideful, cocky young man, and you took on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in your pride. That's not someone you ought to take on. You probably don't think I read my email, do you? What? Oh, really? Well, you found out. Do you like the answer? Good. Amen. Thank God. Is there anyone else here with that kind of attitude?"
What Doyle said was law. To be a part of the church, one would have to cleanse themselves of the world, getting rid of all outside influences, including family and friends who didn't believe the church doctrine, and books that were not the Bible. By the late 90s, Doyle's message became even more forceful. He preached that medicine was witchcraft, and illness could be prayed away. Science was a falsehood, and mental illness was nothing more than demonic possession. These intense beliefs came right before Dena and Dena Schlosser joined in 2000. They became mesmerized by his charisma, as so many new members did. And even though attending services meant driving 100 miles round trip, they wanted a sense of community that the church could provide. Dena called her mom Connie most every day, but her mom and stepfather started to notice that the conversation always seemed to dissolve into Dena gabbing on endlessly about Doyle, how Connie and Mick should watch his sermons online, and how they should listen to his audio tapes. They became intrigued, so they did. But what they saw and heard did not inspire them. It disturbed them. When Connie and her husband Mick came for a visit, they wanted to make sure they looked into their suspicions about the church while there. They saw how this church was already affecting Dena and her family. John had recently lost his job, yet they were not worried about their finances because God would provide. Her stepfather Mick, who was also a counselor, stated that the big recurring theme was God's direction in all things. But by July, the couple needed money. Lots of money. The Schlossers actually received about $35,000 between Dena's biological father and from her mother. Mick found out later that a sizable chunk went to the church, as Doyle talked a lot about the reciprocity of Luke 6:38. Give, and it shall be given unto you. During one visit in 2002, Brianna had a cough, and Connie, who was a nurse, brought over some Robitussin. Dena dropped it in the garbage can. We don't use that, she said. We use prayer. And during another visit, Connie discovered that Dena and her family went to church more than just on Sundays. They would generally go 5, 6, sometimes even 7 times a week. With an hour drive each way, some nights the girls, 7 and 4 at the time, didn't get to bed until 10:30. On these nights, they sometimes went without dinner. Connie called worried about the children's welfare, but Dena only replied, God has not directed me to do anything other than what I'm doing. So Connie decided it was time to call the man whom her daughter held in such high esteem. As you can imagine, this did not go well. When Connie called Doyle to tell him he needed to talk with Dena about the kids, Doyle called her a heathen that was infected with the Jezebel spirit. And women who stand in opposition to me have been known to disappear, he allegedly said. Doyle denies making that comment. Are you threatening me? Connie asked. Women who stand in opposition to me have been known to disappear, Doyle repeated. Connie slammed down the phone. This just pushed Connie to try harder, but nothing seemed to work. And unfortunately, by the fall of 2002, the bank foreclosed on the Schlossers' home, so they moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Plano, Texas. Dena started leaning heavily on Doyle Davidson as her husband dealt with their financial troubles and her mother's Parkinson's was getting worse. When she would talk to her stepfather, her conversations focused on the church and more exclusively Doyle. Connie became very worried and went to visit her daughter as often as she could. One visit, she went with Dena to church. Doyle remembers Connie attacking him, but doesn't recall exactly what she said. Whatever it was, the session ended with Doyle laying hands on Connie, beseeching the devils that caused her Parkinson's to leave her body. That night, when Dena dropped her mom off at the airport, she believed wholeheartedly that Doyle's exorcism worked on her mother, so she took away Connie's Parkinson's medication. But Connie's condition worsened, and full paralysis set in before she could board her flight. Without her pills, she was helpless. She spent the night in the terminal, sitting in her own feces. In the morning, someone in the airport noticed her condition, dug through her luggage, found some pills that Connie had forgotten, and was able to get her back to Chicago. On yet another visit, Dena would make plans with her mom and stepdad, but continually canceled and would only bring the kids by for a few minutes at night after church. Connie, who was so fed up, said to Dena, "You've changed. You've drastically changed, and it's not for the better." All Dena did was close her eyes, hunched over, and in a whisper chanted, "God is great. God is merciful. God is great. God is merciful." She would not answer her mother. By 2004, John and Dena were totally indoctrinated into Doyle's teachings, that when their daughter Maggie was born, they used a midwife to help during labor. John was very against the child being born in a hospital. Even after the midwife had concerns the birth would be more difficult than anticipated, but the Schlossers refused. Maggie was born in their apartment on January 9th, 2004. John stated he loved it, but Dena had a different feeling about the event. She believed that she had given birth to twins, a boy and a girl, but the boy had died at birth and already returned to God. And the day after the birth, Dena was reading the Bible when the word "cut" jumped off the page, so Dena slit her wrists. John found her in the bathroom holding the baby with blood stains on the floor. But John didn't think to take Dena to the hospital. Instead, he put band-aids on her wrists, and the couple prayed about her condition until she improved. Then, 5 days after this incident, while John was at work and Brianna was at school, Dena was at home with her 2 youngest daughters. Her 5-year-old Kelsey was watching The Little Mermaid when Dena heard characters from the movie talking to her. Then, the television itself began laughing at Dena. She burst out of the apartment. Kelsey chased after her, but her mother, only 6 days after giving birth, was walking much too fast. Police were dispatched to an intersection about 2 miles away from their apartment, where they found a woman standing with her arms raised heavenward. Officer Tony Dickerson was the first to arrive on the scene. When he tried talking to Dena, she screamed. A scream as loud as he'd ever heard. Dena spent that night at a mental health facility where she was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, an illness far more serious than postpartum depression. Only about 1 or 2 women in 1,000 births has it, and it's devastating. There doesn't need to be any prior history of mental illness, and the birth itself triggers it. She's got all the symptoms: homicidal, suicidal, paranoia, mood swings, delusions, and hallucinations. But John believed the best place for Dena was at home with him. He pleaded with hospital personnel to take her home. What worried John more, in fact, was that Dena's religious talk was being confused with psychosis. To clear things up, he gave the hospital Doyle's number as a reference, and only 23 hours after being admitted, Dena was discharged. But they still had to deal with Child Protective Services, who viewed Dena as a Priority 1 case. They were more worried about the suicide attempt that John didn't take seriously over Dena out walking Kelsey and leaving Maggie at home. But this was because they were missing some information, as Dena failed to report to the hospital or CPS about the TV talking to her. For 2 months, Dena was not allowed to have unsupervised contact with her children. John's mom moved in with them during this time. CPS also planned nearly daily visits to the Schlossers' home, some unannounced. And they referred Dena to Life Path Systems, which provided mental health services for the uninsured in Collin County. Dena then went on antipsychotic medication. Suzanne Arnold was the caseworker assigned to Dena and later stated that the medication was a huge issue, and every day she asked to get off of it, as she was worried it would affect her breast milk. Though it was later found out, she wanted off the pills because she believed medication was evil. Dena's elderly neighbor and best friend, Carolyn Thomas, told Dena to take the pills anyways, as sometimes prayer wasn't enough. She later was quoted as saying, "I'm too independent. I'm a Jezebel, but I'm only a Jezebel in the time I need to be." Dena, by contrast, was submissive to John 100%, Thomas said. And John said she didn't need medication. Still, the drugs worked, and for a few months, Dena seemed to be doing well. Her hallucinations stopped, and John's mother returned to New York by mid-February. Also, beginning in March 2004, CPS only checked in twice a week. This progress made John and Dena believe she didn't need the drugs anymore. They were going to church more than ever, and that their prayers were working. They pleaded with her psychiatrist from LifePath, who oversaw Dena's prescriptions. He allowed her off medication so long as she checked in with him monthly, and that CPS reported her progress to LifePath. Being off her medication did not bring about continued progress, but instead, all the success she achieved over the past few months came crashing down. For the next 6 months, Dena suffered a series of delusional episodes, such as when a boy came to the apartment asking for water, Dena thought he was Jesus. And she feared a neighbor's dog would eat her, same as the dogs who ate Jezebel in 2 Kings 9:10. Later it was stated she had a preoccupation with the Jezebel spirit. On May 18th, a CPS caseworker stopped by and noticed Dena looking depressed. Dena said she was just tired and stated she was disappointed with herself and wanted to please God. Dena had been awake for the last 3 days poring over the Bible, but left out that information to the caseworker. When she left, she gave Dena her number and told her to call if she needed anything. But Dena didn't call her. Instead, she awoke that night and checked herself into Plano Medical Center. Once admitted, an attendant found her on the bathroom floor, growling. Even so, John persuaded the doctors to release her back into his care. She was put back onto the antipsychotic medication. And the next day, they went back to LifePath to have her be put on the medication regularly again. They did not inform the psychiatrist what happened the night before. They also never informed Connie or Mick of what had been going on since Maggie was born. All Dena discussed with them was Doyle. And Doyle's practices were becoming even stranger. Doyle and Lisa Stratton had been having their affair since 1987. But Lisa was starting to lose interest. So when Doyle showed up at her door on September 9th, 2004, she refused to let him in. But J.R. Statton, Lisa's husband, and one of the 12 apostles at Water of Life, did let Doyle in. Doyle went straight upstairs to where Lisa was, threw her on the couch, and started choking her, saying he was casting out Lisa's demons. J.R. heard Lisa yelling, ran upstairs, wrestled Doyle off of her, ducking a punch in the process, and called 911. When the cops came, a little before midnight, they noticed redness around Lisa's chest and throat. They also smelled alcohol on Doyle's breath. He was arrested for public intoxication. Doyle now states that the arrest report is false and that evil spirits caused J.R. and Lisa to lie to the police. And God will judge them, he said. After Doyle bonded out of jail, he felt he was very wrong to have appointed J.R. as an apostle and freed them from the church and its responsibilities.
He gave me a wife, and her name is Lisa. Are you ready for this? And Lisa's a slut. My wife is a slut. How would you like for God to give you a wife that's a slut? Lisa is a slut. And you want to know who told me she was a slut? God told me she was a slut. Could you believe that a woman could be a liar and be my wife? That God gave me. If you're worse than my wife, you're worse than the devil. How would you like to have to put up with that shit? come out here and talk to a bunch of damn Baptists that didn't believe anything. Well, because I had good control, but frankly, I'd like to knock the hell out of her. But I'm not that kind.
JR took Lisa and their children and went into hiding. They never pressed charges, and to this day, former church members and authorities don't know the whereabouts of the Staten family. Dena had been acting strange the whole week of November 12th. Her friend Caroline stated that while she and Dena were driving home from church, Dena started hissing. She wouldn't quit. "Stop that," Caroline said. She began to pray for Dena. Caroline wondered then if Dena had stopped taking her medication. It turns out she had. Dena stopped taking her meds back in July when LifePath screwed up paperwork and incorrectly told the Schlossers that they could only receive the drugs if they paid for them in full, but they couldn't, and never bothered to clear up the mistake. CPS had also closed its case on Dena in October. Around the night of the hissing incident, Dena heard a chainsaw and thought Jesus was building an ark. She walked outside holding Maggie, looking around for the noise, but she never found it. The night after the hissing incident, Dena talked with Caroline about spirits jumping from one person to the other. Caroline told her to put her mind on something pure, like Jesus. Dena was also very distraught over Doyle's arrest. She believed what he had said, and on Friday, November 19th, Dena implored John to take her to the police station to defend Doyle. Instead, John took Dena to work with him so she wouldn't be alone. He didn't notify CPS or LifePath about Dena's behavior, but he did contact Doyle to have a sit-down with him and his wife that weekend. Doyle told Dena she shouldn't get involved with the police, and that seemed to placate her. 2 days later, on the 21st, Dena was getting the children ready for church when she dressed 10-month-old Maggie in white, saying she wanted Doyle to marry the baby. John convinced his wife to put another outfit on the child, and they headed to church. However, after the service, Dena said she wanted to give her baby to God. John told her she was confused. But again, John did not notify LifePath or CPS about Dena's behavior. Instead, they prayed about it and went to bed, not knowing the next morning a horrific incident would occur. I want to give my baby to God. November 22nd, 2004, was the next day after Dena said this to her husband John. When they woke up, John told Dena she should listen to some hymns, as the singing normally soothed her. And even though she said that odd comment the night before, was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, and had been off her meds since July, her husband still left her alone with their 10-month-old baby, took the 2 older girls to school, and headed to work. However, he did think to check up on her and called about an hour later, but she didn't pick up. That morning, while listening to music, Dena had also been reading the Bible, when she was overwhelmed by a feeling something was wrong. A Bible verse from Matthew was reverberating in her mind. If thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. With these thoughts fogging her mind, she didn't hear the phone ringing. Dena was convinced that God wanted Maggie. God wanted Maggie and her to go to heaven. With the sound of hymns filling the apartment, Dena walked into the kitchen and found the knife set. She took out the biggest one she could find, which had a 9-inch blade, and walked over to Maggie's crib. She held the knife over her baby's left shoulder and began cutting, severing her right arm. And according to court records, sweet 10-month-old Maggie died before Dena severed the other arm. Dena then turned the knife on herself, going to work on her own left shoulder. For whatever reason, though, after sawing into her own muscle, she stopped and finally heard the phone ringing. She snapped out of her daze and answered the phone. It was John. She had a tone of voice I had never heard before, he would later say. She said she had hurt Maggie. She said she had cut off her arms. John didn't believe her. Yeah, I did, Dena said. Rather than call 911, John called Doyle. Doyle told him to call someone who could go over and check on Dena. He recommended Carolyn Thomas, so John called the church's daycare to hopefully reach her. Carolyn was walking by the front desk right as the phone rang, around 11:50 a.m. She answered and heard John Schlosser's voice. Carolyn, I'm amazed I got you, John said in a calm tone. Dena said she hurt the baby. What do you mean, hurt the baby? Carolyn said. Thinking, Dena was a fantastic mom. No way she'd hurt her kids. Can you get over there as fast as you can? John asked. I'll try, she said. She hung up and dialed Dena's number. Oh, hi, Dena answered calmly. Carolyn heard the familiar sounds of the gospel music from their church playing in the background. What have you done to the baby? I killed her. Carolyn paused. What did you say? You killed her? What did you do? Dena was silent for a while before answering. I cut her arms off. What? I cut her arms off. Dena, back up. Where is the baby? In the crib. She's dead. I cut her arms off. Carolyn didn't believe her, but she knew this was serious, a new level of mental breakdown. She hung up, dialed John, and repeated the conversation. Other daycare workers started to gather around the desk, all crying. Everyone knew Dena. She'd worked there for a year before Maggie's birth. But one woman who overheard the conversation finally decided to dial 911. The operator then called Dena and dispatched police to her residence. When the police showed up, Dena had blood all down the left side of her body and was still clutching the knife. The hymn, He Touched Me, was playing in the background. Shackled by a heavy burden, 'neath a load of guilt and shame, then the hand of Jesus touched me, and now I am no longer the same. He touched me, oh, he touched me, and oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I know. He touched me and made me whole. As Dena was being arrested, she had a dazed look in her eyes and was heard chanting, Praise God! Thank you, God! When asked why she killed her child, Dena said, I felt I had to. After her arrest, she was diagnosed with manic depression and placed on suicide watch. Dena became uncommunicative and resorted to banging her head against the cell wall. The jail psychiatrist prescribed her an antipsychotic, but she initially refused, telling him there is no such thing as depression. There's only God. Here are some more frightening hallucinations that Dena told a psychiatrist that began after Maggie's birth. She had heard her deceased grandparents' voices whispered from behind a door. A message came through the TV that the woman in a commercial was going to come out and replace her, the defective mother, and Dena would then disappear. And once seen blood on the streets, which turned into apostles who told her the end of days were coming and to be ready. Dena also told the psychiatrist that she wanted to kill herself or provoke her husband to kill her. John Schlosser didn't seem to notice his wife was a psychotic mess, even appearing unemotional when talking to a police detective the day of Maggie's death, not seeming to grasp what had happened. Psychologist Jana R. Long evaluated John following his baby's death and wife's arrest. John told her he felt a little melancholy about the baby's death, but finds comfort that she is praising God in heaven. And disturbingly, stating I was almost done being very sad when I buried her. Long wrote in her report, this absence of grief is either an immature denial of normal human emotions that hover under the surface of this controlled veneer, or indicates a true lack of emotion. For this reason, Child Protective Services took custody of the couple's other daughters, ages 6 and 9, as they were concerned of his capability to care for the children. The agency went as far as asking a judge to terminate the parental rights of both parents, stating that John Schlosser did not protect Margaret from his wife. Alongside John could benefit from parenting education, but he did end up scoring within normal limits on a parenting test, so he was able to regain custody of the girls in January of 2005, but under the condition that his sister lived with the family. John ended up filing for divorce, and in February 2005, a jury took only 9 minutes to decide Dena was mentally incompetent. She was sent to North Texas State Hospital to receive treatment, and after 3 months of doctor's treatment, a judge deemed her competent to stand trial. The trial date was set to start in February of 2006. Dena Schlosser pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to the capital murder charges. The prosecution was hoping to get a conviction for life in prison, and the defense was pushing for hospitalization at a mental health facility. The deciding factor would be if the jury believed Dena knew right from wrong when committing the murder. The M'Naughton rule, or right-wrong test, required the acquittal of defendants who could not distinguish right from wrong. This rule was supplemented by the irresistible impulse test, added in the District of Columbia in 1929. It allowed a jury to inquire as to whether the accused suffered from a diseased mental condition that did not allow him or her to resist an insane impulse. Critics of the M'Naughton rule argued that it was outdated and did not take into consideration the broad range of mental disorders that had been identified by modern science. So it was replaced by the Durham rule, which sought to overcome those problems. It attempted to create a simple and open-minded insanity test that would open up the courtroom to all the information and analysis available to the scientific community about the wellsprings of human behavior, stated one judge. But as a result of such difficulties, the District of Columbia Circuit unanimously rejected the Durham rule in 1972. The court instead replaced it with a standard developed by the American Law Institute, in which the court asserted that criminal responsibility in such trials is best assessed by a properly informed jury that is not overly dominated by expert testimony. To help juries make such assessments, the court required experts to explain the underlying reasons for their opinions rather than giving yes or no answers to simplistic questions. 3 different psychologists testified at trial that Dena was mentally ill and did not know right from wrong during the murder and is classified as legally insane. The chief psychologist at North Texas State Hospital testified that the murder would have been preventable with appropriate treatment. When John testified, he said his wife had shown other disturbing behaviors following Maggie's birth, but didn't worry too much or take her to counseling because she had had bouts with depression after the birth of her other 2 daughters. Doyle Davidson, pastor of Water Life Church, was up on the witness stand for 2 hours. He stated he barely knew the Schlossers, even though Doyle was the first person John called after Dena's shocking confession, and that John also testified earlier that the pastor was his confidant. Davidson's testimony turned odd when he started discussing demons. 4 inches wide and more than 6 feet tall with a tail is the spirit that had appeared over Davidson a year and a half earlier in his new home. It stood in front of me and spoke to me, trying to scare me. The demon had a message. Lisa is not your wife. I said, Lisa is my wife, and the demon disappeared. Doyle stated he realized Dena had demons the first time he met her, when she came to the church and asked for $5,000. He turned her down because he didn't have the money. That was the first conversation and the longest, he said. Testifying more about his demon busting, he explained, "I do not believe that any mental illness exists that is not a manifestation of demonic activity," Davidson said, "and that medication can never straighten out a person. Only the power of God can make a person perfectly sound." Though he did bite his tongue to be careful not to say people should not be using psychotropic drugs, because in his teachings he believed and preached no one should use drugs. Instead, they just needed to pray. But on the witness stand, he said, if they have the faith and God directs them, they need the demons cast out. And if they don't, they need medication. The jury went into deliberations, and by the 4th day, they were deadlocked. There was heated discussion, and timbers flared in the jury room, according to juror Steve Penn. It was a long ordeal, very tiring.
Good afternoon. Still no decision from a Collin County jury deliberating the fate of a Plano woman accused of severing her baby's arms. The jury did have an unusual request for the judge this afternoon, though. CBS 11's Deborah Takahara is live in McKinney at the courthouse with the latest. Good afternoon, Deborah.
Good afternoon, Jody. These may seem like silly questions since the jury has already been deliberating for 29 hours over the past 2.5 days, but the judge responded in a very matter-of-fact way with definitions straight out of a law dictionary. Now, the jury sent out a note about 2 o'clock asking, quote, "We have a question about the definition of deliberation, and a juror wants to know what is the exact role of a juror." The judge defined for them deliberation as analyzing, discussing, and weighing evidence that they heard in order to reach a verdict. And he described a juror as the exclusive judge of the facts proved, of the credibility of the witnesses, and the weight to be given to their testimony. The judge then told them to continue their deliberations. The jury has heard 40 hours of testimony over the past 2 weeks, much of it regarding Dena Schlosser's mental health and whether or not she knew right from wrong at the time she allegedly cut off her daughter Maggie's arms. Legal experts say jurors probably do realize that it is now Friday afternoon. They're facing the weekend. They may feel some pressure to wrap things up here this afternoon, but they say 2.5 days is not really an inordinate amount of time.
Legally insane means that they have to be so affected that they simply did not know right from wrong.
As for these definitions that the jurors asked for this afternoon, the prosecutor told me, quote, "This is a new one. I haven't heard that type of question before." And the defense attorney in the case said, "I have never heard a question like that in my 27 years. No idea how long they might deliberate today, and the judge says he doesn't know yet if he will make them deliberate over the weekend." Reporting live from McKinney, Deborah Takahara, CBS 11 News.
Thank you.
Penn said jurors argued forcefully, trying to change the mind of one man, who wrote in a court note that he had made up his mind about Schlosser the first day of deliberations, and another juror could not decide. Attorneys confirmed a split of 10-2 in favor of a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, and a mistrial was declared. Everything was the same for the second trial, except for the new evidence about a brain tumor Dena had that could have caused hallucinations. A witness in her first trial alluded to a possible brain lesion, but miscommunication between doctors delayed confirmation by a neurologist until weeks after the mistrial. The other difference for the second trial was that both prosecution and defense agreed to allow the judge to make the final decision. The judge said Dena Schlosser met the legal standard for insanity. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was sent to the state mental hospital until she was no longer deemed a threat to herself and others. Her attorney stated, "My own expectation is that she will remain in the hospital for many, many years." After her trial ended in 2006, Dena was sent to Rusk State Hospital to receive treatment. But only 2 years later, in 2008, the judge, based on doctors' recommendations, agreed to let Schlosser out of the institution as an outpatient. She had to follow strict guidelines, such as seeing a psychiatrist once a week, take her medication, among other things. She held down a job and had been abiding by her treatment when Richardson firefighters found her in March of 2010, walking down the street at 2 a.m. Her outpatient status was revoked, and she was then reinstitutionalized at Terrell State Hospital. By 2012, she was back on outpatient status. She was able to get a job at Walmart. That only lasted a short while. A shopper thought she looked familiar and snapped a picture. When she went home, she went searching, and what she found was shocking. There was an outcry from the community, and Dena Schlosser, now going by the last name Latner, was fired. Walmart spokesperson Lorenzo Lopez defended the employment of Dena, stating all associates must pass a criminal background check as a condition of employment. If a charge does not result in a conviction, then we have no way of knowing an applicant's previous criminal charges. The prosecutor from Dena's trial was quoted as saying, he wants to see the state consider adding a plea for guilty by insanity instead of the current option of not guilty by reason of insanity. Although, just because someone gets sent to a mental health facility and is released doesn't mean they are free. They have strict guidelines, and a judge can revoke their rights at any time. The whereabouts of Dena are unknown, but I do know that a condition of her divorce to John stipulated she is to have no contact with her other two daughters. An excerpt from Newfound Religion, Mothers, God, and Infanticide gives an interesting look back into the history of infanticide. It reads as follows. Infanticide dates back to ancient times. In Greek city-states, for instance, disabled newborns were left outside to die of exposure. Other ancient cultures, including Muslim, Hindu, and Chinese cultures, practiced infanticide for varying reasons. In the Middle Ages, infanticide was common in Western Europe, and different methods of killing infants, such as overlaying a child, suffocation, were considered merely venial or minor sins. In the 17th century, the concern over infanticides or illegitimate children resulted in the 1624 English Concealment Law, which provided that single women who concealed their pregnancies were presumptively guilty of infanticide unless they could prove the child was born dead. In the 18th and 19th centuries in England, infanticide was so common as to be considered an epidemic. In the United States, infanticide had been criminalized as murder and is not treated as a separate offense, as opposed to in England, where the Infanticide Acts of 1922 and 1938 treat infanticide as a lesser charge of manslaughter. There are 3 categories that can describe postpartum mental illness: baby blues, postpartum depression, and postpartum psychosis. The baby blues mostly happens for a few hours or up to a few days after childbirth, consisting of crying, mood swings, and anxiety, which affects up to 80% of women. Postpartum depression, a more serious illness, affects between 7 to 17% of new mothers and lasts around several months. It has the same symptoms as clinical depression, including loss of interest in usual pleasurable activities, loss of appetite, sleep disturbance, fatigue, excessive guilt, and suicidal thoughts. Postpartum psychosis is much more severe and rare than postpartum depression, affecting only 0.2% of new mothers. The symptoms include hallucinations or delusions, severe depression, and thought disorders. Often, the hallucinations or delusions are commands to kill the child, or delusions that the child is possessed by the devil or evil spirits. This is a long-term and progressive illness where symptoms disappear and then reappear more intensely. Often, criminal trials of infanticidal mothers are an opportunity for spectacle that further silences women. Media and legal discourse portray the mother as a monster. The trial of such women has been described as the mad women's capitulation to the narrative of others. The mother's voice is silenced, and society views her not with compassion, but with antipathy and a desire for revenge. Doyle Davidson is still active with his church, and his services still broadcast on television. He has a new wife named Kathy, who was also married to someone else when God chose her to be his new wife. Here's an audio clip of Doyle with his new wife, Kathy, during a sermon that was televised.
You never knew me, but I was really active. No, you didn't. You learned some things about me, but you didn't know how athletic this body has been.
I know it has lots of speed to it because I've tried to it has a lot of speed to it. Yes. We have tried to outrun, outjump, squirm out of your way and have not been able to.
Why were you trying to squirm away from me? What? Come on, tell me the truth. Tell it.
I don't know. What time are we talking about?
Look, don't you mess with me, woman. Why was you trying to squirm away from me?
Oh, who knows?
Oh,
there was.
Come on. I wasn't trying to rape you.
No.
All right, make it play, because the witches and the wizards think that's what I am.
I see what you're saying.
Well, I'm not. No. Never have been. All right? You were trying to run away from God, and I wouldn't let you run. Right?
Right.
Now, are you going to be more honest?
His daughter, also named Kathy, married Terry Mai, and they lead worship at the church. I will end this episode with a note posted by Doyle to Facebook on July 8th, 2011. It reads as follows.
A second situation involving the methods of the Jezebel is the Dena Schlosser. You may not know anything about the woman, but you will if you continue to follow this posting. Sometime in the year 2000 or 2001, Dena Schlosser, who lived in the mid-cities, appeared at a garage sale of a woman who attended Water of Life Church of Plano. The two became somewhat friends. After hearing of my ministry in Plano, Texas, Dena Schlosser appeared at one of my morning services. After the service, she came up to me and talked to me about her financial problems, which were many. She asked me if I could give her $5,000. I informed her I did not have that available. Some months later, Dena brought her mother to a morning service at my ministry. After the service, this woman, who was clearly demon-possessed, came up to me attacking viciously with her demons spewing out of her mouth. I was used to that kind of demonic activity, and I was not moved. I only saw Dena periodically attending services for the next 3 years. Some women indicated to me that they saw her more frequently than I did, and even rebuked me openly when I said I didn't even remember her bringing the child to a service. I said to them, well, you may have seen the child, but I never did. In September 2004, I was falsely arrested by the Plano police. I determined I was falsely arrested by reading the police report, and you can do the same by reading the report yourself if you are honest. Following the police arrest, John Schlosser and his wife Dena appeared at a Sunday service in November 2004. After the service, John Schlosser came up to the pulpit to talk to me. During our conversation, he shared with me that Dena, his wife, wanted to go to Plano police and tell them it was wrong for them to arrest me. I said, well, where is Dena? I turned to her and said, you do not defend me. God is my defense. John said, I have told her that. Jezebel never likes for her opinions to be rejected. I believe the next day, trying to lay the responsibility on me, she took a butcher knife and severed her child's arms and killed it. The Plano police came to me and I had no knowledge of what happened. 2 detectives came to talk to me, and at the Schlosser trial in February 2006, one of these detectives testified under oath that I was evasive at their questions. I was not evasive, and he lied under oath because I did not know anything about it. For 1.5 hours at the Schlosser trial, the district attorney, through the defense lawyers, tried to prove that I was partially responsible for what Dena Schlosser did to her baby girl. I knew I had nothing to do with this demonized woman, a Jezebel, killing her daughter. But theologians, psychiatrists, judges, lawyers, and citizens with influence that hated my ministry wanted it destroyed. I stood against spiritual wickedness at the trial with my faith. Dena was found not guilty by reason of insanity. I only have one question about that trial. Authorities reported that x-rays had revealed that Dena Schlosser had a tumor of the brain. However, whoever the Collin County authority was that was in custody of those x-rays failed to report it and bring the x-rays to the trial. Why? Frankly, I don't believe them. I don't believe the x-rays ever existed. This woman is a Jezebel, full of witchcraft. Read about her yourself. You may Google her name or mine and find out much about her trial and life.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button below. If you want to inquire about a commission, you can email Russell at russellstewart.art@gmail.com. You can watch Russell livestream his art on Twitch. And if you want to hear more true crime stories, you can subscribe to my podcast, Crimes of a Decade, a Texas true crime podcast. Now that we are done, make sure to wash with the brush. Just beat the devil out of it.